Okay. I mean, I'm conscious, Mike, that this is a challenging time for all of us, but particularly for the elderly and vulnerable. So maybe in some senses, how would you respond in terms of this isn't really the time for mission, this is a time for doubling down in pastoral care? What would you say to that?
That's a very good question. And I think I see churches responding in different ways. I think some churches certainly initially had a deep concern to make sure they maintain pastoral care, organising lists of phone numbers, realising that in some cases there had been a panic about data protection that meant that people hadn't had accurate lists of numbers and contact details, and some churches have been playing catch up on that. Once that initial work has been done and people have been, in most cases, I think now linked with support groups as well as ministers doing quite a lot of individual telephone calls, a lot of churches have started to look outwards and to think, how can we make ourselves present to, and how can we speak to the whole community? And then when we think about the move online, there's really the sort of the Zoom versus YouTube dilemma, I suppose. I mean, I know there are other platforms out there, but in many ways they sum up the difference. Some churches have gone for Zoom as their main way of meeting. So my local church in the village where I live is using Zoom. So we have lots of little screens and we can all see each other. We had just over 100 people log in, but it is a fairly well attended local church. That's good for the church members, but it does mean that the wider community can't really get in. And I'm conscious where I live here that the people up and down my street don't necessarily have open access to church. On balance, I'm more encouraged where I see churches using open access Facebook groups or YouTube, which can be widely publicized, so anybody can click on the links and to see what's happening. And it's interesting that people are doing that. There are much better services out there. In fact, one of the best I've seen so far was Church of Scotland. But obviously loyal Anglicans might want to watch the Archbishop of Canterbury, but actually if it's your local minister, and if your local doctor's surgery is mentioned in the prayers, your primary school is named, then people realize it's worth watching, even if it's a bit fuzzy and there are one or two blips in the way in which it's delivered, because it still is saying that your local community matters. And I've had to do a bit of encouraging one or two of our ministers who have been really quite reticent about using new technology and have said, well, no, we've given people a list of all the interesting services you can access. And in one or two cases, actually church members have said, we're really missing the minister in this particular town. We want to see her, we want to see him. And getting people's familiar faces on the screen, I think, is really important.
Interesting. I never imagined you as a supporter of televangelists, Mike. How would you respond to that? Because we are very skeptical of American evangelists and, big screens and digital. I mean,
yes.
Is this all real? I mean, can this make a missional impact and transformation in people's lives?
That's really interesting. I think the fact that a lot of what's going out there on YouTube and in other ways doesn't look as slick as televangelism is really important. It's letting people know that it matters, that it's authentic, that it's almost visibly communicating to people, I'm not very good at this, but I'm doing it because I really care about you and I love God, and we need to make this work together. One of my favorite moments was watching a service from one of our towns where the minister had his wife sitting next to him to receive communion for Easter Day. She was wearing the most amazing hat I've ever seen her in. Obviously, she always did for Easter, and you just had to love them. Because it was saying, she's got her hat on, this is us, here's what happens in our town. I suspect the hat was well known. And we need that human touch. In this crisis particularly, I think that the online presence needs to be deeply human. And I think, to be honest, very often when it's flawed and fuzzy, people know it is. They're not to be fooled by what's looking too slick.
We'll come back to evangelism in just a moment, but I want to ask you, besides online worship, what else are you seeing in terms of mission and the response of churches at this time?
A number of different things. One is remembering the church's presence in wider online routes, particularly social media. Facebook, I suppose, is the biggest, but Instagram and others as well. Finding ways of infiltrating local community Facebook pages with positivity and love is really quite important. They can be nasty, venomous places where a lot of Christians don't want to get involved, and finding the wise and the right way, not of being glib, but actually reminding people that their church is there, that people are saying prayers for them, can be really quite important. I found in one or two places simply posting a prepared prayer for people to say, to read on a Facebook site has had a big impact and lots of positive response. Yes, you'll get some cynical as well, but I think it's really worth thinking, how do we infiltrate the other online spaces that are out there? I'd certainly recommend that.
And Mike, are there other lessons from this strange time that you would like the church to take forward?
I think if we are ready to have the courage to do it, this is the time to start trusting our younger members. I found it fascinating that when a number of us were working out what we do about using video and things, some of our youth workers simply got outside in the back garden with a handheld phone and did breathtakingly good stuff, communicating at a very, very simple technological level, but they're just used to it.
Yeah.
Whereas I found some of the sort of the older ministers are thinking, how do I get hold of a tripod, and can I set it up, and will we make sure the sound's all right? Younger people were just doing it, and I think we've got to trust them, and they will take us forward.
Sorry, do you think on that one? I mean, I see sometimes some ministers doing it. I think, why are you doing it? You know, just let the young people do this. Do you know stories where techies or young people are feeling more affirmed or a bit more used in these circumstances?
Yes, certainly. I mean, in one or two situations, younger people are realizing they've got a vital role in things like their editing skills. So a group of parishes where I used to work near Cambridge have produced some very good composite services, bringing together different people doing different bits and pieces of things. Now that has needed somebody with particular editing skills to put it together, and one of the younger church members has been able to do that in a way that I'm quite sure my previous colleagues, the ministers there, wouldn't have managed, and it's great to be able to affirm them in that role. I think as well, one of the things that we're seeing is that younger people are realizing that a variety of faces actually is so important, and doing things like readings and prayers in online services just lightens the mood. And where there's only one face talking, particularly when it's mine, because I watch some of my stuff back and it's a bit boring, having some younger faces and voices really makes a big difference to how things communicate.
That's good. Final question, Mike. You've written a lot and thought a lot about evangelism. What would you like to see in terms of evangelism? How do you see evangelism into the future?
That's a very big question. I think that we need to think about looking forward rather than hoping to go back. That I don't see any sense in which we will simply get back to normal. We're looking at a period of many months of slowly beginning to restore something like normality. And at the end of those months, the church will not be what it was. And I think one of the biggest dangers is if we're trying to hold on to rather than step forward into something new. I think that there should be a natural usage of video, social media as part of the mix in our communications going forward. I think one of the things, for example, that's really interesting is that as congregations often, generally, have got smaller over the last generation, it's harder to sneak into the back row unnoticed. On YouTube, you can do that anytime you want. And I think having that open access available online as a way of giving people a first step, but with invitations, with information so that people can follow it through further, could be really interesting. The other thing I think that's happened in a number of cases is that online resources have been made freely available. I'll be very interested to see what happens with some of the Christian organisations that have done that. Will they start to ask for payment again? If they do, will people have had their interest raised and be ready to pay? And obviously things have to be financially viable, but I think there's a window of opportunity in terms of helping people engage all sorts of different evangelistic resources at the moment, and it's well worth taking that. The other thing I think to say is this is a huge incentive to all of us to think much, much harder about what church really is and how we will grow disciples in the future. Generally for several generations, the normal way in which the churches have grown disciples is to get people to come and sit on a pew or a seat on a Sunday morning. That has been changing already for some time. I think the speed of change has accelerated phenomenally over these weeks, and we will not go back to where we were. So how do we maintain a mix of personal contact, maybe contact with buildings, but not with groups, having our church buildings open again, but as spaces to engage with God rather than sitting in rows while somebody coughs behind you? I think we're going to have to think about that very hard. Thinking about how we can have a combination of some personal contact, but ongoing, linked through social media and so on. If we've had small groups of, say, 8 people sitting closely together in the front room, that may not come back, at least not for a while. But if those people are in a WhatsApp group, regularly sending messages of encouragement, ideas for prayer, that the relationship continues, maybe with fewer and more socially distanced meetings within that ongoing relationship through social media.
Mike, that's really interesting. That's a whole lot to think about there. And obviously, as a Scot, when there's those free resources, I need to slip me the addresses so I can make sure I've got them all. But thank you so much for spending time and sharing what you see and sharing your hopes for the future. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.